Okay, as folks are filtering in, we'll give everybody a moment to come in and then we'll get started. Hey, Christine Nassif, nice to see you. David, I love seeing names I recognized. Wonderful, wonderful. So for those who are filtering in, again, we'll get started in just a moment. Give people a chance to come in. Okay, Martine, I'm going to start my introduction. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the August edition of the iIIRG in Conversation webinar. This is a production of the International Investigative Interviewing Research Group. My name is Christopher Kelly, and Dr. Gary Pankhurst, who's not with us, he's on holiday right now. We are the co-directors of the iIIRG and are very excited that you're all here to learn more about training for the investigative interviewing of children. I'll introduce and turn it over to our esteemed presenters in a moment, but please allow me to do a moment of housekeeping. For those of you new to iIIRG, thanks for being here. We hope to get to know you through our various endeavors besides these webinars, including our journal that's known as Investigative Interviewing Research and Practice, and our biennial conferences. Speaking of the conferences, we just held our last one this past June at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, and we are working on the location of our next one happening in mid-2026. We know many of you are excited to learn about where it will be, and we are just excited to share that information with you as soon as we have it confirmed, so stay tuned. Next, if you're not a member of iIIRG, we hope that you consider joining us to support events such as this webinar, plus gaining access to the largest worldwide network of investigative interviewing professionals, receiving discounts on our future in-person conferences, access to materials such as the webinar recordings, and networking grants, which we offer from time to time. So thank you to everyone who is here today, especially those of you out there for who it is Wednesday. I am in Philadelphia, USA, and so it is Tuesday evening for me. Our first two webinars were inconvenient times for you all, but we are so happy to be able to coordinate this one to truly fulfill iIIRG's international mission. So if you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the Q&A box. There will be a short period after each presentation to ask. I will moderate and throw the questions after each presenter, and then we'll have whatever time left over at the end. We can have a more general discussion. So with that, our first presenter is known to many, if not all of you. Martine Powell is a professor at Griffith University in Australia and the founding director of the Center for Investigative Interviewing. She's a world-leading expert on eliciting evidence from child complainants of abuse and the design and evaluation of effective interviewer training, part of today's topic. Professor Powell has produced more than 300 peer-reviewed publications on the topic of witness testimony, supervised over 35 doctoral students, and has been a chief investigator on numerous Category 1 grants. The influence of Professor Powell's research has been recognized by several lifetime career awards, including membership into the prestigious Australian Academy of the Social Sciences, and I'll also note she is the 2015 recipient of iIIRG's Tom Williamson Award, and also by the wide range of organizations that Professor Powell has been invited to speak to internationally who have sought their expertise in her field. And we all get to benefit from that expertise today. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Powell. Thank you.
Okay, can you see the presentation? Yep. Chris? Yep, all good. All right. So hello, everybody. It's great to hear that there's a wide variety of people enrolled. So I thought we would start with the basics. When we talk about investigative interviewing, we're referring to the process of eliciting an accurate, detailed, and coherent account of an event or a situation. And we gather this information in order to make fair and informed professional decisions. When learning investigative interviewing, it's easy to get caught up in the notion of a foolproof protocol, but the reality is something far more nuanced than just following a guide. Case details and witnesses differ, and in an incredibly short period of time, we need to juggle a lot of things. You know, interviewers really need to think on their feet. They need to establish rapport and trust with the interviewee, be ready to pivot in any moment, demonstrate autonomy, judgment, and responsibility within broad parameters. Focused on the needs of the person, asking well-crafted questions. Every interaction is different and each case is unique. So interviewing is a complex skill that can be difficult to master. It's not intuitive, it's not an art form, it's not easily learned on the job. And knowing what to do, having a protocol, is not the same as doing. In fact, the gap between recommended and actual practice is one of the most talked about issues in the investigative interviewing field. To interview well, you need to undertake an effective training program that will teach you the skills and how to implement them. And that's the focus of the presentation today. I'll give you a snapshot of what the science tells us about effective training programs and the elements needed to learn effective interviewing. Now, my talk today is focused on using non-leading open-ended questions in the context of interviewing children about abuse. I define open questions as those that encourage elaborate responses, so a narrative account, without dictating what specific information is required. This is compared to short answer questions or interrogative or specific who, what, when, where questions. Now, I've chosen to focus on this skill because it's one of the most important and fundamental skills in learning how to interview, and most interview protocols around the world agree on this. But I do want to point out that the core elements that constitute effective training relate to all skills, not just learning open questions. So if you're looking to master open questions, as with any skill, there are 5 core elements to your learning, and let's take a look at them one by one. The first element is the establishment of buy-in for the learning. And what I mean by buy-in is acceptance or willingness of the learner to engage in the learning. You know, motivation plays a big part in learning any skill. And to be truly motivated, you need to believe in what you're doing and understand why you're doing it. So in the context of using open-ended questions to interview children, the value of these questions has been well demonstrated in research over the decades. But your learner interviewer may not share the scientific beliefs or understandings. Their experience may have told them otherwise. So for good learning outcomes, there needs to be a common understanding about why the training is needed. And this may involve busting any myths or misconceptions that the learner has that are standing between them and their learning. Now, there are a few common myths that are alive and well among professional interviewers. For example, many professionals believe that children's responses to open questions don't contain much detail. Well, this is not true when you ask well-crafted questions. Another myth is that good interviewing is associated with certain personal attributes or background factors related to the interviewer. Again, not true. Another misconception that I like to clear up early in training is the idea that you can tell if a child is giving an accurate account. In reality, the best predictor of error is the degree to which the interviewer deviated from non-leading open questions. Now, course designers need to tackle these misconceptions early, but it's not just their responsibility. Organizational leaders play a big part in creating a culture that either supports or refutes these myths. And Linda will focus on that topic next. The second critical element in training programs is the scaffolding of learning. What this means is that there are many sub-skills involving learning how to interview, and an incremental approach is needed. A lot of our training evaluation studies have focused on understanding which individual activities should be presented and in what order. To give an example, one of the first skills that needs to be mastered is understanding the various definitions of questions and their effects on response detail and error. Think of it like learning scales in classical music. The question definitions provide the foundational knowledge and framework for improvisation. We also know that rote learning of question stems is needed before putting a variety of questions into practice in mock interviews. Now, the training evaluation work has also highlighted that people need to learn at their own pace. And this is a problem when training is conducted in large cohorts in classrooms where everyone works through the content in lockstep. When you take people out of lockstep, it's much easier to tailor practice to their individual pace and needs. That's why our centre, which works with trainees across the globe, has moved primarily to online learning, at least in early stages of skill development. You know, once people have mastered the basic principles and definitions, then it's fine for groups to come together in a classroom or on Teams to reflect on the application of the skills in their field. That's a situation where being in a cohort can be helpful, but it's usually held at a later stage. Practical application is key, and that's the next essential element of training and one of the most important. To master interviewing, skills need to be practiced in simulated interviews. It's not easy to practice on the job. And exemplars of good performance need to be provided for role modelling. Focusing on the how-to is so important but under-recognised. In a recent review of training manuals, some of which were over 150 pages long, only an average of 5 lines was devoted to applying open-ended questions. Courses are bogged down in too much theory and not enough opportunity to demonstrate. You may have heard of the term transfer of learning in the field. For this to happen, trainers need to figure out what behaviours or responses trigger interviewers to deviate from recommended practice, so veer off from open-ended questions. The trainers then include those triggers in the simulated interviews. So in child interviewing, the triggers might be opaque responses, that's it, responses, or silence. Think of the mock interviews as walking a plank. The trainer's job is to rock that plank just beyond that interviewer's skill level. The interviewer's job is to sit with the discomfort when triggered and use the skills that they've been taught to navigate the challenges. We also know that practice needs to target specific goals and be well spaced. There needs to be enough time to reflect on the learning and authentically reinforce new habits, behaviours, and ways of thinking in the face of increasing challenges. Crash courses don't lead to mastery. And when it comes to investigative interviewing skill, time and repetition produce the best results. The issue of reflection leads nicely into the fourth element, which is feedback. Expert feedback goes hand in hand with practice. Now, self-evaluation has its place, but not initially. Until people have a good grasp of best practice, they tend not to be good judges of their own performance. You know, experience might instill confidence, but some of the worst interviewers are the most experienced and confident. Without constructive and objective feedback, a trainee really has no way of knowing if they've achieved the goals. But the delivery of feedback is just as important as the content. Feedback that's too direct or formal, such as traditional marking or pointing out strengths and errors, or feedback that's perceived as a personal attack, has been shown to lead to a decline in performance. It's important for trainers to understand the content deeply, but also instill confidence and enthusiasm in learners. And this is key. Feedback is not just about the giver, but the receiver. If the receiver isn't in the right framework to absorb feedback, there is only so far that persistence and skill delivery can go. Now, again, organisations play a big part in instilling a culture of continual improvement, as well as instilling a curious and reflective mind. The science highlights that feedback form, and think of mock interviews. You know, how a person responds to a question is feedback about the question's effectiveness. Rewarding good questions with evidential detail and providing opaque short responses to bad questions shape performance through behavioural reinforcement. The final element is evaluation, the dreaded word that many people say they don't have the time or money to do. The problem is that designing programs by intuition or trial and error costs time and money as well. Organisations deserve to have reliable data on what they're investing in, and without testing samples of a participant performance using objective measures, it cannot be concluded that the training has had any positive effect. Evaluating performance is essential to gauge the true depth of learning. With superficial learning experiences, people tend to fall back old habits quite quickly after. This follow-up evaluation is where the true story lies. When we evaluate a training program, we often follow up months or even a year after course completion to determine how well the learning was sustained. In our experience, when participants engage in deep learning experiences, the need for ongoing refresher training is reduced. Evaluation data is the only way of determining this. The final point I want to make is that standardization of performance and evaluation go hand in hand. We found it useful to develop a quick formal test with objective scoring criteria that can successfully predict performance in the workplace. This objective measure ensures consistency of experience, which is needed for good evaluation research. So in summary, investigative interviewing is a highly specialised field of work which requires specialised training. Today, we've touched on the key elements needed to close the well-documented gap between recommended and actual practice. And I also emphasise the important role of organisations in supporting learners' needs, which is up next. For a recap on some elements we explored today, please refer to the following papers, or you can go onto our website. There's a full bibliography of the evaluation research that we've been doing. And if you want to learn about how to receive feedback better, which is really critical, this is an excellent book which summarises the science in a conversational way. And on the topic of feedback, I would love to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Professor Powell. Quick question before we move on to our next presenter, and it's about the principle of application. And I can't tell you how many trainees I've been in front of who love to use that phrase, at least here in the States, death by PowerPoint. And that is absolutely the case. But I was wondering, in terms of your, for training child interviewers, if how do you practice what they learned? Do you bring in child role players, or do you use adults that pretend to be children?
Yeah, it really depends on what aspect of interviewing they need to learn. I mean, if you really need to learn about how your questions can be misunderstood or misconceptions arising, then it's good to interview actual children about a staged event, because that will give you a sense of how they're hearing the questions and responding to them. If you, if you want to learn about the effect of questions on yourself and learn that open-ended questions allow you to be heard, understood, and not judged better, then it's better to have role plays with another person who can easily be told a list of questions and ask you those questions and hear you respond, because that's fairly easy for a colleague or a friend to do. But we've found the ones that have better validity with field interviews are ones that are staged with trainers who know how to respond in a way that will trigger you to deviate from best practice. And that's going to promote best transfer of learning. Hamida will talk a lot more about that in her presentation, how we go about those sorts of role plays.
Great, great. Before we move on, there was a question, a request, and maybe you could do this, Professor Powell, in the chat box where the attendees can see your response, asking for the names of the articles that were in your second to last slide. So you can put them in there for everybody's benefit. And if anybody has other questions, please throw them into the Q&A box and we can come back around to Professor Powell at the end. But we're going to move on to our next presenter. Thank you very much, Professor. Our next presenter is Linda Cordisco Steele, and she is the Director of the Forensic Interview Training and Services at the National Children's Advocacy Center in the United States. And she has over 30 years of experience in therapy and advocacy work with victims, having been conducting forensic interviews since 1993. Ms. Steele joined the NCAC team to form the Forensic Interview Training Program and has been a crucial part of its development since. In addition to conducting forensic interviews at NCAC, Ms. Steele conducts international training and consulting, including work on a project with the Council of the Baltic Sea to increase the quality of forensic interviews, and also worked with Japan to develop a culturally responsive forensic interview protocol. Ms. Steele has conducted more than 500 forensic interview trainings nationally and internationally, including in Brazil, Ecuador, the UAE, Qatar, Croatia, Guyana, Okinawa, Slovenia, and Thailand. Wow, what a great passport you must have. Finally, Linda serves as a thought provider to the field and has been co-published with other researchers and authors throughout her career. So welcome, Linda. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you, Martine. And I think you'll find that some of my opening comments are really going to mirror a lot of what Professor Powell has had to say to us. So this issue of developing skills in forensic interviewing has really been at the forefront of my thinking for a number of years now. I think we have many excellent training programs that initially get new interviewers or new professionals to the field going with developing their forensic interviewing skills, but how we actually change their practice, change their behaviors, help them internalize this is what we're really focusing on and working on now. So this quote, which is one of my favorite quotes and comes from a book called The Talent Code by Daniel Coyle, and mirrors what I think is really important and essential is greatness isn't born, it's grown. The ability to really listen effectively to a child and to craft these questions is something that takes place with practice. So initially, we have to have the introduction to the material, some introduction to the theory, some clear laying out of what the skilled behavior is that we're seeking. And then we need to practice it. And we need to practice it with the help or assistance of someone that's providing that coaching. If you have access to a master coach, that is fabulous, and that's going to be wonderful and really up your ability to internalize the new material that you've been taught. But what I particularly also love about this image is the word up here which says ignition. So it truly is an interaction between engagement, commitment, hard work on the part of the practitioner, as well as the expertise and the attention and time of the coach in these recreating and repeating these practice sessions that eventually results in the talent. So I want to talk a minute, again, beyond training, about the importance and the role of deep practice. So this is really going beyond just minimum adequate skills, moving toward superior practice. And Martine did a lovely job of identifying some of those basic skills that we really want interviewers to internalize. Use of those good questioning, recall-based questions, implementation of their protocol, providing social support. All of those skills need to be taught and identified, but then we need to have practice opportunities to work on this. And it does. I absolutely am in agreement about this is a sequential process. It certainly doesn't happen in a 1 week or a 2 week or any kind of short learning opportunity. It's that jump starts us, but this is what has to follow. It's hard work. It's hard work. The good news is it doesn't have to be extensive, time-consuming practice sessions, but really targeted practice sessions that work on some of these basic skills. So providing short learning opportunities and repetition is what enable us to really rewire our brain. So we've heard the adage that practice makes perfect, but actually practice doesn't make perfect. It only makes permanent. So it's not just repetition, repetition, repetition. It's breaking down the skills that we think are essential for interviewers to have, chunking it up, slowing it down, practicing those skills, having access to targeted specific feedback, and then repeating it, and then repeating it, and then repeating it. So one of the adages I use with interviewers I work is this: we want to fail forward. So there's nothing wrong in practice sessions with in addressing, encountering, coming to terms with our mistakes, but it's not stopping there. It's the repetition to improve. So we master one of these habits, perhaps with just repetition, 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 in order to create that sense of this skill is automatic. I don't have to think about how to frame or phrase an open question or recall-based question. That becomes more automatic. And once I have that skill kind of under my belt, then I'm ready to begin to address other skills. So that mastering a field is really repetition of this process over and over again. So we know how to do this. I guess the positive news is we know how to do this. We know enough about adult learning. Those of us that have worked deeply and intensely for years with interviewers know that we know how to do this, but we don't. So why don't we? And this is not a blaming or shaming kind of a thing. There's so many other contextual factors that encroach on individual communities or child advocacy centers, investigative interviewing agencies about why we don't actually do this. Part of this, who do we have doing our forensic interviews? Is there a real commitment on the part of the individual that has been designated with this task of doing forensic interviews? But as Professor Powell also addressed, it's the overall agency responsibility to really acknowledge that this is an important task. And if we don't have that commitment, this is not likely to happen. And who has ownership of this? Who's responsible for the development of good interviewers and good interviewing skills? Who has the money? Who has the resources? Who has the power? Who takes responsibility? So in my role here as the Director of Forensic Interviewing Services and Training at NCAC, I can take a lot of responsibility for the interviewers that work directly under me. But for the interviewers that I train from across the United States and in other countries, I really don't have that level of responsibility about what happens following the interview training. And it comes down in many cases to the financial issues. Do we really have the money? Yes, sending interviewers to training is very important, but do we invest in the long-term development of their skills? And besides the resources, do we have skilled practitioners to provide the feedback? So the best and most effective feedback is going to be specific. It's going to be based on knowledge of good practice in forensic interviewing, and it's going to be really targeted to the development currently of that individual interviewer. Do we have people that are prepared, that have grown into the role of being able to be skilled supervisors of forensic interviewers? Forensic interviewing is a complex task. So it's not just a matter of clicking off, did I go to training? Do I go to peer review? It's really taking the time to dig into the development of a very complicated skill set. And this is often being undertaken by agencies and individuals with big caseloads, with competing demands, perhaps from agencies that they work for, deadlines from that organization, that really can complicate this matter. And one of the things that has been most at the forefront of my thinking in the last years has been, how do we develop really skilled supervision? So I also come out of a mental health background of doing clinical work, and I really grew up sort of with this idea of supervision as a really big part of someone's development. But where are the supervisors? Who of the interviewers has access to those really skilled supervisors? Do those people that are really knowledgeable about interviewing, what have we done to help prepare them about effective methods of supervision? Do people stay in this field? Is it a field that people pass through? Or do people stay in it for the long haul? Developing mastery with any particularly skilled process just takes time as well as commitment and work, continued education and growth. And do we have the commitment to do this? Have we paid attention to really building effective teamwork? I know that for supervision, it's going to be far more effective if the supervisee has confidence and trust in not only the skills of the supervisor, but that person's also recognition of who they are and commitment to them. So we do know feedback is important, and really well-timed, specific feedback can be so beneficial in one's growth and learning process. But the problem with, at least for us in the States, how feedback often is delivered is it really is too little too late. We really need to develop programs where immediately following that training, new interviewers have access to consistent, skilled feedback. And feedback is most beneficial if it's targeted to the developmental level of the interviewer. And I'm not talking about their age or their stage of life. I'm talking about where they are in terms of working on their skills around forensic interviewing. It can be too complicated for a new interviewer. It can be too simplistic for a more experienced interviewer. It needs to be targeted to who they are and where they are at the moment. Feedback is most beneficial if it is specific, if it addresses the nuances of the skill that the person is practicing or working on and seeking feedback about. And this whole idea of chunking it up and focusing on a particular area of development at, a one or two things at a time, I think is most effective. Often interviewers get a lot of feedback about a lot of different areas, and it may not really translate it into helping them be able to apply their feedback to what do I work on now. And perhaps the biggest problem that we see is it has to be consistent, it has to be regular, and it really should never end. It certainly is more important and essential in the beginning, but it never goes away. So moving forward, I think some of the things that we as a field really are needing to address, and I'm not diminishing the what an enormous challenge this is, but we need to really come to appreciate this is not just nice people talking to kids or people trying to get information from kids so that we can figure out, about protection or prosecution holding someone accountable. We need to really appreciate the complexity of this task and the importance of the people that are in this role. Once we have done that, then I think an additional thing for us to work on is how do we, in addition to initial training, how do we develop these mechanisms for increasing supervision? You can call it a supervisor, you can call it a coach, you can call it a mentor, you can call it a senior interviewer, but what is the process depending on where you are for this person who is an interviewer receiving support, training, education, moving forward?
Thanks, Linda. A quick question for you before we move on to our last presenter, and it's about providing feedback. And we all know the challenges of giving constructive feedback, but also recognizing the difficulty in sometimes receiving feedback, especially when it's criticizing a person's performance. So what suggestion would you have for everyone out there to approach that in a way that doesn't turn people off from the message?
That's a great question, and thank you for that question, whoever put that question in. I think it's important to build it in quickly and early, and it needs to be about smaller things. If you initially begin receiving feedback about behaviors you can change, things you can do something about, and that gets repeated about other smaller things, then it becomes, it gives that person something they can actually accomplish. It's when we let them go too long and then we blindside them with a whole bunch of critical information, not encouraging to any of us.
Good. Good. Well, thank you, Linda. Okay, our last speaker is Dr. Hamida Zekiroski, and she's been a member of the Center for Investigative Interviewing since 2016. She currently works full-time as both a researcher and an industry trainer. And in fact, she is out on location in the field, eager to get out there after she does her presentation, but we're happy to have her with us. Dr. Zekiroski's industry expertise relates to the strategic development of online course design for investigative interviewer trainees, with particular focus on the content, structure, and timing of effective practice interviews. Dr. Zekiroski, has worked with a broad range of industry partners and has led several training research evaluation studies, evaluation being an important point, and we will come back to that, involving frontline police officers and police recruits. So with that, turn it over to you.
Thank you. Just bear with me while I share my slides. Sorry, we did practice this morning. Okay. Okay, can everyone see my slides? Can I just get a verbal yes?
You're good.
Yes.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Chris, for that introduction. So good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you all today. My presentation is on the role of mock interviews when teaching open-ended questions. So mock interviews, also called staged interviews or role plays, is where learners practice using good questions in safe simulated environments. So specifically, I'll provide a brief overview of the how-to of staging effective mock interviews from a trainer perspective. So this includes how to schedule mocks, the scenarios you choose, who should play the role of the interviewee as well. So this presentation adds further context to the elements that Martine and Linda talked about earlier. So there are many forms of mock interviews, and here are some that we use at the Centre for Investigative Interviewing. The most common type of mock interview involves a trainer playing the role of an interviewee. And I refer to a trainer as someone who has received specialized training in how to play the role of the interviewee, to reinforce good questions and to provide feedback. So this is a picture of me doing a mock interview with a police officer over a digital platform like Zoom or Teams. And these interviews can also be done over the phone or sometimes in person. Mock interviews need not have a trainer playing the role of an interviewee. So an untrained colleague, for example, like a fellow participant in the training course, can also play the role of the interviewee. Mock interviews also don't need to involve a human trainer. So here is an example of a digital avatar that we use in the centre. The trainee interviewer chooses the best question, and the child avatar responds accordingly. So this provides flexibility in scheduling the mock, and the feedback can be provided immediately along with a full transcript. So currently we are working on a collaborative project led by SimulaMet and OsloMet in Norway, and that's to develop a dynamic avatar that can respond to questions in real time. So with the development of AI, these types of mock interviews will become more and more common. And finally, we stage mock interviews and we film them to provide exemplars of best practice. And these sorts of mock interviews, so where we can illustrate certain techniques in a concise way, they're also important. So there are a variety of different mocks, but what are the factors to consider when choosing or staging one? I've thought of 5 factors, so now I'll talk you through each one. So the first factor to consider when staging mock interviews is accessibility. And Martine mentioned the importance of space practice, where ease of use becomes a critical factor. So if you have a lot of trainees living across vast geographical distances like we do, then staging practice sessions over Zoom or Teams or the phone is going to work best. So actually phone interviews in some ways are better in the early parts of training because they are easier to administer because obviously you don't need a computer. And because people can focus more on their question structure and not have to worry much about things like their body language or eye contact and things like that. We have a booking system where we schedule sessions with a role player at a time that is most convenient for the learner. So it gives them more control over their learning and eases the administrative burden on us. So when choosing mocks with a role player, we started out training professional actors, but this didn't really work out so well because these people disappeared for long periods of time when they got acting gigs. So as you can see on the screen, this is a screenshot, in fact, of one of our booking pages. So it's actually for today's date. So as you can see under select staff, it says anyone. So if you clicked on that arrow next to anyone, it will drop down to reveal a specific trainer. And this is also handy if for whatever reason we wanted to dictate which staff member the learner should complete their mock interview with. And this is also handy if the trainee had a preference. And then at the bottom, you can see the time zone. So when you click on the arrow next to the time zone, it would convert all the times to show the availabilities based on wherever in the world you'd be located. So for example, there's a 7 a.m. time slot availability showing for Melbourne today. And I know for a fact that we have a trainer working in Vancouver today and it's their afternoon. So the second issue to consider is whether the mock interview will reinforce and promote good questions. So this is the trickiest part of staging a mock interview. Although it's fairly easy to get someone to respond to closed questions with a one-word answer and open questions with more elaborate responses, the ability to shape more fine-tuned or nuanced learning requires deep-rooted understanding of the content you're trying to teach. For example, will an interviewee's response show you that your question was leading? Will the responses distinguish between different types of open-ended questions? So in our evaluation research, we have shown that mock interviews lead to the best improvement in performance when the person playing the role of the interviewee has an intricate knowledge of the content being taught. So irrespective of the train-the-trainer model that we've put them through, what we've found is that people who have done the training themselves to a high level, so not just skipped through the content, have had understanding of the science of memory and have had experience training mock interviews tend to be the best at getting improvements from learners over time. Our little digital avatar can also improve performance. The problem with her, however, is that people choose rather than say the question. So this is where the newer dynamic avatars have the advantage, provided that they're programmed well to promote good questions. The third factor to consider is how well mock interviews promote self-sustainable learning. So to be effective, learners need to develop a positive mindset, develop active strategies to deal with interview challenges, and stay motivated to reach certain goals. So if people view learning activities merely as a hurdle that they need to pass to get a certificate, then they won't likely practice beyond the life of the training program. Further, if mock interviews are way too hard or if the feedback is perceived as too negative, then people are not going to identify as good learners. So it's that careful balance between giving useful feedback, for example, not making people think they're doing a great job when they're not, and making people want to keep learning. So this is something we've learned through trial and error. Although academics tend to give more precise feedback than others, some have the art of motivating people to keep learning better than others. So a trainer like myself, who's hardwired towards seeing more detail, needs to learn to hold back and just talk about one or two behaviours at a time. Active participation in generating feedback and incremental learning is also important. Also, it's better to minimize your sense of authority. So avoid the I'm the expert, so do as I tell you type of mentality. Rather, it's better to enhance the degree of agency the person has over their own learning. The next consideration is the type of scenario. So many interviewers say they become more engaged if the topic of the interview matches what they do in the field. This is true. However, the development of a good scenario is not just about matching the event. You also need to have deep-rooted understanding of the context of the interviews. So for example, we train a lot of school teachers, and these professionals would typically only interview a child about abuse to establish whether or not to report the abuse to the higher authorities. So when playing the role of a child interviewee, therefore it would be it would be more valuable to make the event opaque. So if you provide a clear disclosure too early, the teacher will automatically stop questioning because in real life, it's beyond their scope. So it's helpful to get scenarios from organizations, but the role player needs to unpack these and develop quite an extensive story so that the content can be drip fed in response to the questions. So untrained or underprepared role players tend to blurt everything out in response to the first question, and then they don't have anything to say. So if you don't have something to say, then how can the learner practice their questions? So unless a role player is really experienced, we tend to restrict them to 1 or 2 main scenarios, and we don't increase the number until they become quite habitual. And finally, at our centre, we are fortunate to have funding and staff to enable continual improvement, to enable a continual improvement model where we evaluate each new training course. And in this sense, knowing that each learner has the same experience, irrespective of who plays the role of the interviewee, is extremely important. Having a standard response procedure is beneficial for many reasons. For example, refining and evaluating training procedures, effective selection and monitoring of individual interviewers. So telling an organisation, if allowed, how their proteges are, who their proteges are, identifying training needs, and providing a fair and transparent trainee experience. So providing this standardized response, however, is not easy, and it requires development of a rule book of response styles and quite vigorous training, so sometimes up to 3 months. And this investment can be very costly, especially when staff turnover is high. So a lot of people prioritize professional actors because they think they are better at learning scripts and being in character. But what we found is that the most important characteristic is longevity and being able to stick to the rules given to you. So for example, if you're told to provide 4 details to an open-ended question and 1 to a closed question, you need to actually do it, and not everyone can follow instructions. So I've reached the end of my time, but if you'd like to learn more about the how-to of staging mock interviews, this paper covers some of the issues that I discussed today. Or if you're interested in some free training resources, you may find them on the resources page on our website, just listed there. And of course, I'm happy to answer any of the questions you may have, and I'll also open up the questions for Martine and Linda as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zekiroski. I have a quick question. There's one specifically for you since you mentioned avatars, and this is an emerging area. You know, the research is just coming out, the awareness and the use of them. I was wondering if you could, for our attendees who might be a little less aware of the benefits of avatars, to give a minute on what they are and what they're useful for, what they're most useful for. Hamida, did I lose you? Go ahead.
Yes, sorry. So the avatars in our case, from a training perspective, I think with the mock interviews, because they're so costly, if we can train them well, we can use them to replace us as human avatars in terms of being able to use them as hello?
I can hear you fine. Might be losing your own connection. Hamida, you can continue. Oh, we lost her on the hotspot. It was good for 55 minutes. Well, apologies about that. If Hamida can rejoin us, she will. I know she has to move on to her job. But we do have a couple of questions that Martine and Linda, if you have a moment to field. This is coming from Jenny Cole, who says, having changed my approach to narrative assessment pre-police interviews since completing one of the Griffith courses on interviewing. And Jenny Cole asks, what role do you see for witness intermediaries in feedback pre-interview to police officers?
I think intermediaries have a role, but like anything, it depends on the knowledge that they've got. A lot of intermediaries I have seen across countries, they often are selected because of their speech pathology background. Now, speech pathologists, that knowing the effect of question on error is a very particular pocket of science that's developed through investigative interviewing cognitive psychologists. So while some of the ones we've observed are very good at simplifying a question, unless they understand the background on the effect of questions on error, then some of the feedback might not be, comprehensive in that sense. But I think one of the issues is if that gap between what recommended investigative interviewing and what people actually do can close, then the use of the intermediaries may be less. And in particular cases where they're drawing on their expertise in understanding what sort of challenges that witness will have, as opposed to just giving feedback about whether that question was appropriate. And so I think when training is good, then the basic some of the more basic advice that we're seeing at the moment would be eliminated. But I hope I explained that well enough.
I followed
Linda
it well. I hope Jenny and others did as well. So Hamida, welcome back. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I'm sorry. The hotel switched me to their Wi-Fi
Right on
from my
time.
hotspot. Okay, sorry. The avatar question. It was, if you could just repeat it for me.
Just an introduction to what avatars are, what they are, and what they're good for.
Okay, so I can only speak to what the application could be for our training.
Sure.
I know in our training context that in terms of what we do, it's very costly. It's a big time investment to train up trainers, as Linda was saying in her presentation. What we could use the avatars for is to train trainers, and the benefit here is that, as explained before, like if programmed well, they can provide immediate feedback to the learner on their responses. They could pretty much replace what we are doing as humans in being able to reinforce good questions, knock them off that plank that Martine was saying. But what we're finding at the moment is that we do need to work on the programming part, because at the moment we do invest a lot of time in training the trainers on how to work with the interviewers and those nuanced questioning, like how do you program an AI to do? I'm sure we'll get there,
Yeah.
but just picking up on those nuanced phrasing and those things that rock the boat and throw people off when they're questioning a child. We'll get there, but I'm just not sure how long that's going to take. Yeah.
Maybe much
But
quicker than any of us can realize.
Oh, 100%. But training trainers, as I think Linda will agree and Martine will agree, it's a big time and money investment.
Yeah.
And so I think moving towards the digital avatar is something that we would all love to see. Like, I'm happy to say that I could be out of a job in that respect, yeah, but
Well,
I think it's the way of the future.
Yeah.
I don't think we can deny that that's just the way that we're going.
There was a quick follow-up question about avatars. Is there an organization that provides this kind of service that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of. We are doing research with the Norwegians at the moment, brilliant researchers. I don't know, maybe Martine can speak. I'm not directly working with them.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with a particular organisation, but there's a lot of researchers in this space at the moment. So I think it would be important to write to those who are doing the AI work itself.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I can imagine. Go ahead,
Chris,
Linda.
if I could just jump in, I think for me, we don't use avatars, but with the program with the Council of the Baltic Sea, that's part of the training that we do there. And it seems like right now, the advantage is in the rote learning phase. So avatars can be programmed to respond rotely to an open versus a closed question, and different skill sets, basic skill sets. I think it's going to be the nuances. Maybe someone can come up with it, not me at this point.
In the closing seconds we have, there is a question about coming from Brazil about interviewing, the tools to evaluate interviews. If there's something that's available that anyone knows of that can be provided in terms of providing quick feedback, these instruments used for evaluation in the field. Is anybody aware of those?
Yeah, the trouble with just drawing on tools is that it really the feedback needs to be embedded within the training and the particular training that you're doing and the particular skills that you're at that time. I mean, one of the issues in investigative interviewing, depending on the cohort of interviewees or depending on the group, our fine-tuned definitions of open-ended questions and other questions, and the way you classify, like I said, the scales and the music, the way you classify your question structure differs. So if you've got an instrument from another group that is not the way in which the terminology you use, it's going to actually be confusing. So I think rather than picking up a tool, you need to look at the training as a whole with all these jigsaw elements within it.
Understood.
I agree. And I think it lends itself to possibly a kind of becoming just another one of those checklist kind of things, which doesn't really lead to changes in practice and behaviors.
Right. Okay, well, we'll close it out there. Before we go, I want to let everybody know that a recording of this will be made available in the coming weeks, both on the iIIRG's website and the Center for Investigative Interviewing's website, which I've posted there in the chat. So with deep appreciation for everyone coming, especially our wonderful presenters today, thank you, everybody, and have a good day or a good night, depending on where you're coming from. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.